So I'm going to start off with this question. Do you know the way to heaven? And I'm going to answer this question the way all good rabbis, even though I'm not a rabbi, all the way good rabbis and psychologists and teachers and Socrates and my Uncle Mac would answer it. It was with another question. And in particular, I want to ask you, who's asking? So I've told this story before, and I'm going to tell it again and see if I can remember all the details. It's a little bit convoluted and a little hard to get my head around, but it seems that years and years and years ago, maybe a century or so ago, maybe two, in the Middle East, there was two communities, the Christians and the Jews, living pretty much side by side and getting along pretty well. But as time continued, they began to bicker. And as the bickering began to increase and intensified, they thought less and less about solutions and ways of dialoguing, but instead more about defining themselves and taking their stands to differentiate themselves. They just sort of drew in, and the fences got higher between them until finally it was clear they weren't going to resolve the conflicts. So somebody had to go. There wasn't going to be room for both of them. And they both agreed, the two communities agreed, that the fairest thing to do, given their own faiths, that they wouldn't be violence. They should have a debate of their intellectual ideals. And this would determine who was the wisest and should begin then to inhabit the land, continue to inhabit the land. The other community would have to leave. So they agreed on it. Well, after the Jewish community had agreed, they were sorry they'd said yes, because they looked about their community and realized they really didn't have a scholar. They really hadn't had a scholar in some time. They got a little bit lazy with how they sort of thought about things. They were more present with one another. They kind of did stuff. They were more active, but they didn't study so much. And so the only one they could think of was this guy named Yekel, who was sort of like a milkman. He sort of milked the cattle and stuff and sort of cleaned up in the stables, but he wasn't really a scholar. But they asked him, and he said he'd be happy to go up against whoever the Christians brought up. And the Christians, of course, turned to their scholar, and having been more accustomed to having defined themselves, to having sort of to think about what it is they really believe, because they were the new kids on the block, so to speak. So they called for Brother Andrew. And Brother Andrew came forward, and they designated the day. The two of them stood in front of each other and began their debate. Now, there was only one rule to this debate. Because it was going to be between two different communities and kind of two different faith interpretations, they would use sign language. This would be the most honorable, sort of the most egalitarian approach. And so they agreed to this term and thought very clearly through how they would approach it. And the first one to begin was Brother Andrew. And Brother Andrew held up 3 fingers. Now, Yekel looked at that, and he wasn't surprised at all. He just shrugged his shoulder and held up 1 finger. But then, to that response, Brother Andrew looked and said, he used his hands, he kind of pointed to his palm, and then he made a wide arch. This stumped Yekel, and you can imagine why. Right? You have no clue. He was stumped. He looked back at his community. He didn't know what to do until he turned around. He had a scowl on his face. He took his fist, and he pounded into his palm, defiantly. Well, now at this, Brother Andrew was completely baffled. He seemed desperate. He turned back to an acolyte, a trainee in the faith, sent him off to the chapel, and the guy came back and he was carrying a loaf and a chalice. And he set the 2 elements on the table there beside Yekel, who looked confused at the 2 elements, turned to someone, and in just a moment, someone brought back a bag, and Yekel pulled out an apple and slammed it right next to the elements. And at this, Brother Andrew threw up his hands, looked at his community, and said, I don't understand it. He works in the stables. We lost. Well, they couldn't believe it. They knew that the Jewish community hadn't studied their own faith doctrine in so long. They'd sort of just been busy about being a community as such. They kind of forgot about all this stuff. And here they had been studying and so were so devout to their concepts and ideas, they were beat. They walked away to prepare themselves. They said to Brother Andrew, how could you lose to this guy? He works with the chickens and stuff. And Brother Andrew said, I don't know. The man is wise beyond his means. He looked at me, and I told him, I said, our God is the Holy Trinity, the three in one. And he came back at me and said, yes, but God is the one true God. God above all else, the God of creation, whole and complete. I thought, well, I couldn't answer that. I couldn't beat that. So then I told him, yes, but our God spans space and time, is here and is beyond, the Alpha and the Omega. He came back with that and he said, yes, but God is a very real historical presence with us now. And I couldn't beat that, and so I did the only thing I knew how. I brought out the elements of our faith, broken for one another as our Lord was broken for us. And I set them at the table, and he brought out the apple to remind us yet we all still are sinners. We've lost. He had an answer for everything. Meanwhile, they're back at the chicken, with the chicken guy and the stable and the animals, and they're looking at him, and he's busy back to work. And then they said, Yaakov, how did you beat him? And he looks up and says, I don't know. I'm still wondering what just happened. He said, well, what happened? What did you say? He said, well, first of all, Brother Andrew looked at us and got real rude. He said, you've got 3 days to get out of town. I looked at him and said, we're going to stand and fight. And then he said, well, we'll chase you out of town. I said, we will stand and fight, and our God is the one God. We'll stand and fight with God. And then he did the strangest thing. He brought out his lunch, I brought out mine. There's a lot to keep in mind in this story. So you ask yourself, because I asked myself, first of all, realizing that I have to make a connection. I don't just want to tell a story and a joke, although there's nothing wrong with that. But what does this actually have to do with the question of where is heaven? So I'm going to start first with something, and that is the blessed irony of life. Life is full of ironies. It's in our questions that we ask. It's in our everyday living. It's all around us all the time. Just turn on the news. Life is filled with ironies. Our political scenario seems like we've been here before, right? Only now the guy who everybody hated years ago is now the front runner for Republicans. And then this other guy whose family have all been in politics, and whose mother said, of all things, this one does not need to run for president. And now he's running for president. And she's saying, he'll be great. I mean, we adjust. Life is full of ironies, though. We find it in our religion. We find it in our politics. We find it in our global crises. We see crises happening all around us. We fail to see how we can be the cause of a lot of these crises. It's a lot to try to swallow, a lot to try to take in. In our local churches, we fail to see the big picture. We fail to see the dynamics, just like in the great debate. It's interesting to me that, of course, as funny as the story is, no one really tried to solve the problem. Perhaps instead of debating, they should have just sat down at the table and talked. Asked each other questions. So what did you do today? What do you find meaningful in life? Ask me and I'll tell you, and go back and forth. And let's think about what we find in common first. I heard Jim Riddlesberger, who's back in the back, and I didn't mean to bring you up, but since it's a small room and you're back there, he gave a wonderful talk at the UMW, and I thought that was really interesting. One of the things he said, which I just think is true about all of our life, is that our politics get caught up in debating over what we hold, or what we believe in, what we define ourselves by, what we sort of hold into ourselves and hoard even, and yet very little would have to do with what we find in common. And what would politics be like if we actually tried to find things in common, tried to go from that standpoint first? I think it's true for the church, too. It's true in our businesses. It's true in our relationships. We rarely see the big picture. We almost always live out of the small. One of my favorite experiences with my father-in-law when he was still alive, Marvin Fox, Linda's father, was he was an accordionist. He was a German. He was German Texas. Loved the accordion, played here at the church for groups. I loved it first thing when I met Linda, and we were dating in high school. She just looked at me and she said, "Do not ask my father about the accordion." And I'm like, well, what does that have to do with anything? She said, just don't bring up the accordion. Don't bring up flight. He was an aeronautical engineer. So I brought up the accordion, he brought it out, and we had an evening of polka music. It was awesome. And so years later, we bought this wonderful Far Side cartoon, and many of you have seen it. It has heaven and hell, and it shows heaven where the angel's giving people harps as they walk in, and hell where they're all getting accordions. And I remember my father-in-law looking he didn't get the joke at all. He's like, I don't see anything funny in this. And he was true. It was right. The big picture sees that here's a man whose love and life is all about accordion music. They'd be handing those out in heaven. And yet we tend to get caught up in the small. We tend to always live out of our own perspective. The second curious point about the story of the Great Debate that has to do with heaven is that in thinking about matters of faith, these things typically become static. Beliefs become institutionalized, ritualized, and often fail to respond to what's present. The thing that I've often said in here, that we should start with that vantage point of we don't know what we don't know, or we only know what we only know. Well, that's where a lot of people of faith stop. We know what we know, and that's all there is to know. And so we make ironic blanket statements like, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Or in Facebook, when I recently saw a response that was to the Supreme Court rulings back in June about same-sex marriage, and then most recently because of all of the, about the Kentucky justice who's now been arrested because of not carrying out the law of the land, so to speak. And one of the supporters for her had this great sort of picture, and it had a picture of the Bible and a person standing next to it kind of with their fist, and then it said, I believe everything this says, and I'm not ashamed of it. And I wanted to go, are you sure you believe everything that it says? And then the irony, because she was also, if you look through her Facebook, because I did, I was just kind of going like, who is this person? They're big supporters of gun rights. And I'm going to step on any number of toes in here. That's okay. She was a big supporter of gun rights and probably an NRA member. At the same time, she was, anti-animal rights activist. She was heavily made, when you looked at the picture, she looked like she was trying out for a Dallas Cowboys cheerleader. I mean, was full of all sorts of ironies that said, this person doesn't know the answer to the first question I asked about where do we find heaven? Who's asking? She hasn't got a clue. Most of us don't. It takes a while. You have to put some effort into figuring out who's asking. That favorite little poster that I've carried around, the little bumper sticker that I carry around sometimes on my ukulele, and I've talked about it in here before, where it says, beware the dangers of stupid people in large crowds. And we're all going like, amen to that. And then someone asks the interesting question, who are the stupid people? Because the other side that we think are the stupid people are looking at us and saying the same thing. Beware the dangers of stupid people in large groups. We all suffer the judgments of our own irony and often fail to see it. And I think the main reason why is because it's our simple human nature. We naturally tend to limit the limitless, to define and confine things eternal and infinite, to seek our paths and actions and places in response to who we are. Matters that are infinite like beauty, joy, truth, and goodness, we define these things most typically in the context of our own lives, in the context of where we've come from, in the context of what we're made of, in the context of what we're afraid of. Some is naturally biological, some of it's sociological. But the question is, how much of that is really theological? Because theology is dynamic. Theology isn't static. Just like learning is not static. Learning is dynamic. And if you look at the quote from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which I put in the bulletin, which says, all the world is crammed with heaven, but only he who sees it takes off his shoes. Illusion. Shoes, yes. You're welcome to take yours off if you'd like.
She already did.
Oh, she already did. Awesome. Well, I would take mine off, but I'm wired to a mic, and it scares me just the slightest. So I'm not sure if I have anything to worry about or not. But we know that what we have, that all we know is that which we have grown up with. It's all we know. But here's the challenge. It's all we know, and yet there's so much more to know. So the first question I would have to ask, and do you know the way to heaven, would have to be, who's asking? The second question I would ask is, what is heaven anyway? Because ultimately our descriptions of heaven are most likely going to be limited to the answer to my first question. Did you put up that first picture? I forgot to ask you, Austin. Did we get that first picture up there? We can show it real quickly. I forgot to mention this. A wonderful irony here. Calvary Baptist Church, and down below it says Dan Davis Law Firm. I just thought that was interesting. A church with a legal firm. That's not a bad idea. I guess all churches could use a law firm here and there. Maybe it's an appeals case kind of thing, you know. Just anyway, I just thought that was I got that from David over here, David Smoot. Thank you, David. David travels around in his business, sends. Anytime you all want to send me ironic images, please feel free to. I love that stuff. So as you're traveling around, plus it's good encouragement to look for irony, I think. It reminds us of who we are. But if we look at the New Testament picture of heaven, I think most of us would probably dislike it. I mean, the idea of going to heaven doesn't sound very appealing. Typically, if you look at the sort of fundamentalist, conservative, right-wing Christian who says, I'm no longer a part of the institution, because the institution is all about gold, it's all about the tall ritualistic statues, about the fancy sanctuaries, about the sort of, they might judge it as a club-like kind of atmosphere, about all of the ritual, which doesn't seem to make sense. No, we just have the Bible and ourselves and Jesus, and that's what we worship. Well, if they look at the biblical version of what heaven looks like in the book of Revelations, it pretty much looks exactly like what the church is today in terms of the institutional. It's got the liturgy, the vestments, the chanting, the incense, the candles, the chalices, the tabernacles, the Blessed Virgin Mary, St. Michael the Archangel. All of that is in heaven. Do we have a picture of it? Okay, well, the next picture. Oh, did I not send you the other picture? Michelangelo's? Oh, I missed that. Okay, I'm sorry. All right, well, this is the other picture. This one is sort of the static picture that we're left with when we get rid of sort of the Michelangelo version of heaven with the Trinity sitting at the high throne, the clouds all surrounding us, and the various individuals half dressed and half naked, all standing around singing choir hymns. There's no band up there. I'm sorry. There will not be a band in heaven. There will be an organ, but no, she's going like, not in my heaven. We're going to have harmonica. We're going to have cello. Yeah. This is My Little Pony heaven. That's what I like. This is the kind of... And like my granddaughter's going like, what's wrong with that? It may just be human nature, but we've forgotten how to be dialectic. We've mostly forgotten how to ask questions that engage us dynamically. Instead, a lot of folks think about beliefs statically, and they become fences and walls, and they become strongholds. Which brings me to my final point. If there is one aspect of the biblical narrative of Jesus' life that remains consistent, that also seems to hold water with other religions in the world, it seems like it's this idea of empathy. This idea of compassion, which is a fairly simple concept, really. And yet it seems to be hard for us. And so we congregate to groups that are like us. We congregate to places that do things that we like, that help us feel safe. We bring who we are and what we are made of to these scenarios, and then we look for people who we can identify with. And it just builds the walls higher and higher. And it seems like what the gospel is always all about, what Jesus' life was always all about, was turning the safety upside down and opening up. Engaging with empathy, with compassion. If there's any quality to what we may know about heaven and the kingdom of God, it appears that it is an engaged process. It is dynamic. It is a verb. It's not how do you get there. It's show up and be present. It's respond in whatever way is possible. It's engage. It's discover. It's love. It's create. It's care for. It's listen. It's pay attention and notice. It's risk and be vulnerable and reach out. And so the disciples ask, Well, then when did we see you? We were busy, kind of keeping things intact. And Jesus' response is when you started looking and noticing and responding. And I'm not simply going to say that it's the right thing to do because Jesus said so, or because John Wesley said so. Do all the good you can in all the places you can. Because I'm doubting Thomas. If you know me, you know that my motto in here is something that Todd Kirk said to our group the other day, and I thought it was perfect as we were in our book study group, and we were thinking about, well, who is 1111? Then Todd said, 1111, all your answers questioned. And I thought, genius. We're going to claim it, though. Because you see, for me, it doesn't just have to be something that's just said because it's too easy. I don't trust myself. I don't trust myself to identify with a group and go, I know it must be true because it says it's true. They say it's true. For me, I have to engage with it. Ultimately, selfishly, there has to be a payoff. And I've shared with you in here what I think that payoff is. When we engage with one another, when we risk being vulnerable with one another, when we risk moving into a little danger zone from where we feel like we're confident and comfortable, with openness, with our ego set aside, with our fears honest and recognized, but we're moving through. When we set limiting beliefs aside and we start risking giving ourselves to another in a really open way, even in the midst of a conflict, something happens. If you've done it, you know it. If you stepped out of your comfort zone and you said, I'm going to go ahead and take time to spend with this moment here. I got other things I should be doing, I could be doing. I don't really want to, I'm going to go ahead and take time. If you've done it, you know what I'm talking about. Because something starts to happen. We suddenly feel like we're getting bigger. The encounter suddenly feels like there's something here I hadn't expected. And as I've mentioned before, life becomes more interesting. Not only do we become more authentic, life literally becomes interesting. If you look up the word, it's one of my favorite words. It's what we do when we tell our stories to one another, when we listen to one another. We make one another interesting when we pay attention. And the verb literally means to bring being together. You want to bring life into the world, engage with people. Not just with those that you're comfortable with. You're not going to grow out of that. We're not going to go anywhere with that. Open up. The kingdom's much bigger. Like Michelangelo's stone, there are angels and creative moments awaiting in every static moment. And all we're asked to do is to be present and see what we can coax out. So here's this last koan because my title had the subtext of koans. And I love Zen koans. There's a knock at the door, and the student, Chow Fin, is asking to enter. The master, Tsin Dogen, inside says, who's asking to enter? He answers, Chow Feng. And the answer comes back from Tsin Dogen, the answer comes back, there's no one here. Well, that's very frustrating. He's been studying with his master for a long time. So he comes back the next day, knocks on the door a little more persistently. Again, from the voice inside, who's knocking? Who's out there? And again, the voice says, Chow Feng. And then Tsin Dogen says, there's no one here. This goes on for days. Until finally, about 5 weeks later, there's a knock at the door, much more hesitant, much more cautious. Tsin Dogen inside says, who's there? Who's asking to enter? And after a long pause, the voice on the outside says, Tsin Dogen. And the door opens.